Okay. Hi, everybody. Happy Friday. Happy Easter. I guess it's Easter weekend back in North America and most parts of the Western world. They don't celebrate Easter necessarily over here, but you do see some Easter candy in some of the supermarkets and shops and whatnot. So the spirit is alive in the Middle East. Um, I guess we'll end the week talking a bit more about motion sickness and looking at the Draper paper, the Bertolucci and Daddario paper, and Eden and Zook paper. So just to recap some of the stuff that we talked about on Wednesday. When it comes to motion or simulator sickness or other types of sickness that are induced by motion, there really is no universally accepted theory, even in this day and age. And I'm sure that I think as we would all know, that's not something unique to motion sickness. There's probably quite a few other concepts, especially in the world of human factors, where there's no universally accepted theory. But the predominant theories that exist still today, we talked quite a bit, I think, on Wednesday about the sensory rearrangement or sensory confusion theory. And this theory offers good explanatory power, but unfortunately not very good predictive power. This is something that hasn't necessarily been operationalized or demonstrated mathematically so that we can accurately predict how somebody is necessarily going to react in a certain environment given different types of stimulation or sensory inputs. And it doesn't necessarily do a good job at explaining why nausea results. So we have conflicting signals from the eyes, from vision sensory inputs, and our vestibulary inputs. But the fact that those get confused when sending the signal to the brain, how that then elicits this nauseatic response, and people actually get physically ill, it's unclear as to what the mechanism is behind that within the confines of this theory. The next theory, we also talked about this one, I forget the specific paper, but we talked about it quite a bit on Wednesday, is the subjective vertical theory. So within this theory, they define the sensory arrangements that are nauseogenic. So this is a refinement, basically, of the sensory rearrangement theory. And it specifically focuses on the otoliths, because the otoliths are the sensory vestibular organs that sense linear motion. And they provide us with a subjective sense of what vertical is, so basically gravity. Similar to the sensory rearrangement theory, though, there's limited predictive power with this theory. And this other theory, this is talked about in the Draper article, is this ecological theory of motion sickness. And it posits that it's the environments that create extended periods of postural instability that produce these symptoms of sickness. Now, again, this theory is not very good at predicting things, specifically what environments will produce the instability, and then from that will then induce sickness. So its utility is also somewhat limited. Simulator sickness. I think this is, when we talk about motion sickness, this is something probably of specific interest to us in the world of human factors, because we use simulators quite extensively in training environments and also in assessments of human performance. I know in the nuclear industry, when they run validation exercises to test basically the design of a control room, they use a simulator to do that. They don't use the actual control room. So simulators are certainly important within the world of human factors. So simulator sickness, that's a type of motion sickness. I think that's pretty obvious. And it's caused by simulation imperfections. So these are technical type imperfections. So simulation can only reproduce a subset of real world environmental information. and the information is often changed or distorted during simulation. And then the last one of these, I'd say, major imperfections with simulation is that we need to introduce superfluous or information or models into the virtual environment in order to fill in these gaps, because we can only reproduce, as the other bullet says, a subset of the real world information. Simulator sickness has been shown to be influenced by past experience with motion sickness generally, exposure time in a virtual environment or in a simulator, individual factors such as age, gender, binocular viewing, display field of view, which we'll talk a little bit more about. It's one of the specific, it's focused on in the Draper article, and other things as well. So if we go back to that model I put up on Wednesday, that had all those different factors around the periphery that could potentially influence or moderate motion sickness or sensory inputs that then affect the symptoms or cause symptoms of motion sickness, you would see there's a fairly close correlation to these factors and the factors that are in that model. Two of the predominant imperfections with simulation, and these are the focus of the Draper article. The first being image scale magnification, and the second being system time delays. And so we'll talk a bit more about what those are as we move along. So let's get into the meat of the Draper article now. The basic question that they were trying to examine is, well, initially, do these factors, image scale magnification and system time delay, do they influence the experience of simulator sickness? And if so, which of them influences the symptoms of sickness more? So let's talk a little bit about both of these factors. Image scale magnification. So what this basically is the ratio of the display field of view to the geometric field of view. The geometric field of view defines the horizontal and vertical boundaries of the scene and its aspect ratio. So basically, and you'll see that there's this figure from the article below on this slide. What the GFOV is the angle subtended on the viewport from the center of projection. So what happens is that the image is projected on the viewport and it's then rendered onto the display screen. So this is what people actually see in the virtual environment. The integration of this geometric field of view and the display field of view create an image scaling factor. So when we have a situation where the geometric field of view angle is smaller than the display field of view angle, then the geometric field of view has to be magnified. So you see that in the upper right quadrant of that figure. And this is because we have to fit the display. And what happens as a result of this is the optical flow rate also increases. When we have a situation where the geometric field of view angle is greater than the display field of view angle, then the geometric field of view has to be miniaturized. And as a result, the optic flow rate decreases. In the cases where the geometric field of view angle and display field of view angle are the same, so we have a ratio of 1, then the viewport maps correctly to the display, and we don't need any scaling. So there's no miniaturization or magnification. And this is the optimal or the ideal situation. System time delay is a little bit probably easier to conceptualize. And what this basically is, it's a lag in the virtual reality's response to the user's head motion. So when people are moving their head side to side or up and down, navigating within a virtual environment, if the generation of the image that they see lags behind them moving their head, and you can't see me, but I'm mimicking what that would look like with my head here, then that's basically what a system time delay is. So this is primarily an issue with the technology and technical limitations, but it can also cause performance degradation, so how people perform within the virtual environment, and also a lack of user acceptance. So I think we saw in that one article that talked about aircraft inspection, those were the two questions within the questionnaire where people had issues with the virtual environment when they compared it to the CBT, was in the area of time lag. So there was this distinctive lag between when people moved their head and when the image actually caught up to it. So we'll look at each of the studies that Draper and his colleagues conducted in order. The first study looked at the effect of image scale magnification on simulator sickness. The measures that they used for sickness were verbal reports by subjects and also a sickness questionnaire. The task they performed in the virtual environment was using a head-mounted display, and it was a simple visual search task. Each of the subjects had a little bit of time to practice, and the task itself was basically the researcher would say, find this object in this virtual environment, and the people would have to find it and report that they found it. So after conducting the research, some of the high-level results. What they found was that just exposure to the virtual environment itself induced sickness. So if you strip away the image magnification stuff, just having people experience a virtual environment, that induced some reports or subjective rankings or ratings related to sickness. Both of the conditions, the miniaturization and magnification, resulted in higher reports of sickness compared to the neutral condition. So when they had this image scale magnification factor of 1 in the neutral condition, there were still some higher than, say, not being in the virtual environment reports of sickness. But when they had miniaturized the image or magnified, so we had ratios less than or greater than 1 of the geometric field of view compared to the display field of view, we had more significant reports of sickness. And the reports of sickness were more significant from the questionnaire data, not on the verbal reports. So there's this simulator classification system that's been developed, and it's based on quite a bit of simulator sickness questionnaire data, like from over thousands of different simulator studies. When you compare the ratings that they got on the miniaturization and magnification conditions in this simulator experiment, they would be considered. This would be considered as a bad simulator, which is not good. Certainly not desirable. One other finding was when there's a slight amount of head movement, that's been shown in the past to lead to an increased level of sickness. Just minor head movements, not large head movements, smaller head movements. There was a reduction in head movement in the magnification condition, but the fact that it went from larger movements to smaller movements didn't lead to increased sickness, which is an interesting finding and a little bit counterintuitive to maybe what you would expect. So the second study was set up basically the same as the first study, only in this case they were looking at the effect of time delay, not image scale magnification. The other thing that they did was they added a postural stability platform, and I assume, and it says actually, I don't have to assume anything, it says in the article this was basically to examine the ecological theory of motion sickness, which is based on postural instability. The results from the second study, similar to the first study, just experiencing virtual reality or this virtual environment induced simulator sickness in subjects. However, it was lower than in the first study. The participants noticed the time delay, and the time delays were in the order of 125 milliseconds and 250 milliseconds. But although they noticed and perceived this time delay, their sickness ratings didn't change. Well, they changed a little bit, but not much, with the increase in time delay, which is a little bit not what was expected. In this situation, under these conditions, this virtual reality would have been classified under the simulator classification system as a simulator with causing negligible symptoms. So potentially okay or fit for use for training or other applications. And with respect to head movement, as exposure time increased, head movement also increased. And because there was this increase in head movement, and it's been shown that larger head movements don't necessarily result in sickness reports, this may lend some additional support why sickness didn't increase. As exposure time went up and people had more time in the simulator and adapted a bit more, that may also be the case why sickness didn't increase, because of adaptation effects. And as I said here, it says here in the brackets, just to repeat basically what I talked about on the previous slide, is that smaller head movements usually relate to experience of sickness. Some of the overall takeaways from this study. So the results of study 1 support the sensory rearrangement theory, but the results from study 2 don't. And the reason for this is basically you would expect to see an increase in sickness as the time delay was increased from 125 to 250 based on the sensory rearrangement theory. But this didn't occur. Now, this may have been because the range of the time delays wasn't sufficient to produce this effect. Another possibility, and I don't know if they talk about this in the article or not, but I just considered this, is that maybe we have this built-in sensitivity with the sensory rearrangement theory that tops out when we talk about time delay and its effect on motion sickness or inducing motion sickness. Maybe the sensitivity tops out at 125. So any time lag less than 125 or more than 125, we're going to see a reduction or a decrease in symptoms of sickness. But at 125, that's when you see, that's kind of the high point. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I guess obviously more research would be needed to see if that's the case, but it's certainly a possibility. The researchers state in the article that their results illustrate a fallacy of utilizing the sensory rearrangement theory to predict simulator sickness in virtual environments. And I find that to be a fairly strong word, fallacy, but maybe they didn't intend it to be as strong as I perceived it to be. But that's why I've got it in quotations here. The data that they observed also doesn't align with the other theories, so the subjective vertical theory and the ecological theory. What they saw was there was really no postural stability issues, but people still experienced simulator sickness. So this ecological theory doesn't seem to apply or support, or the data doesn't support the ecological theory. And the last thing is that sickness doesn't necessarily lead to a reduction in head movement. Now, this is something that was found in previous studies. When people reported higher levels of sickness, they would stop moving their head or move their head less. But this wasn't the case in this study. So the Draper and his article talks about a few guidelines that you may want to use in virtual environment design. And the reason I say use with caution, and I'll talk about this more when I get to one of the potential discussion points, is whenever guidance is given based on the results of, say, one study, although there's quite a few other studies, I guess, that they base this research on and that you could probably find in support of these guidelines, it's just important to be aware of the research behind the guideline, is the basic message here. So the first guideline is to avoid image scale deviations from 1.0. So if you can match up the geometric field of view angle and the display field of view angle, and you don't have any miniaturization or magnification, that's the best case, and try to achieve that. Calibrate the gain and head tracking systems to minimize sickness from inaccurate optical flow rates. So when you have image scaling factors at play, that can also lead to optical flow changes. So I guess if you were able to achieve the first guideline, you wouldn't necessarily need to worry too much about the second one. But in cases where you have a scaling factor, this is when the calibrating the gain and the head tracking system becomes more important. Minimize system delay times for obvious reasons, and limit initial virtual environment exposure to 10 minutes or less. So here's a possible stopping point where you can talk about a few things, and these are just some observations or questions that you may want to consider. So the first, why is there not a unified theory of motion or simulator sickness? Is this primarily due to the seemingly strong influence of individual factors? And the second one, as I talked about just a couple minutes ago, as a human factors practitioner, would you feel confident using the proposed design guidance considering the research that they're based on? And this is specifically the guidance from the Draper article. But I would say this applies to human factors design guidance in general. I know there's a lot of design guidance out there that is very strongly supported by research, but invariably when you get into the human factors, being a human factors practitioner, especially a designer, and you're looking to solve an issue, and you can't really find a guideline that applies, you start searching the web, as we all do in this day and age. And you will come across some guidelines out there, and I think it's just important to know what these guidelines are based on before just putting them into practice. So we'll talk about the last two articles now just briefly. And both of these articles talk primarily about modern day motion sickness remedies. We saw that back 100, 200 years ago they had lots of different types of remedies, most of them not really based on research or science. But now we have some science that supports some modern day remedies. So the Bertolucci and Daddario article, they tested this relief band. And what the relief band does is that it electrically stimulates the P6 acupressure point on the wrist. And it's been shown that stimulation of this point can reduce symptoms of motion sickness and other sickness as well. People get sick, from chemotherapy treatments. So stimulation of this P6 point has also been shown to reduce sickness in those situations. When they compared the relief band use in the proper place to a placebo arrangement where they put the band on the other side of the wrist, there was an improvement reported in seasickness symptoms by people on the boat. Both the intensity of the stimulation and the proper positioning near this P6 point decreased seasickness symptoms. And I was interested as to how was this the case, and they talk about it briefly in the article, what's the mechanism behind how this thing works. I mean, I've had acupuncture treatments in the past, and they've seemed to have helped, but I still don't fully understand the science behind it. In this case, the acustimulation of the P6 point may interrupt or prevent activity in the neural pathways that mediate motion sickness symptoms. So I'm not sure if these are the sensory inputs from your visual and vestibular systems to the brain that could get confused and cause the sickness. So if it's the sensory inputs to the brain, or the inputs or the outputs from the brain that actually induce the nausea that you have from in your stomach area. So after reading this article, I was a bit curious to see if this relief band was a viable product on the market. And I got directed to a website called cband.com. So maybe they just did a rebranding. And for only $9.99, you can buy one of these things. And there's obviously, based we just saw in that article, there's some science behind their use and their effectiveness. So if any of you guys experience motion sickness or are prone to being seasick, and you're on your way to do a cruise or up to somebody's cottage for the weekend on the lake, you may want to pick one of these things up. The Eden and Yakov article looked at a different aspect or a different type of motion sickness remedy. So this wasn't something like where you put a device on your wrist or you take a drug or do something else. This was more looking at the psychological aspect. And they thought that the experience of seasickness may be a self-fulfilling prophecy or moderated by this Galatea effect. And what the Galatea effect is basically a self-belief in one's capacity to succeed, and because they expect to succeed, they've fulfilled this prophecy. So it's been shown that staying active or busy or using positive affirmations can reduce seasickness. So in this study, they separated cadets into two groups. So the cadets in the experimental group were told that they were unlikely to experience seasickness, and also that seasickness was unlikely to affect performance. These cadets reported less sickness and also performed better than the control group, who weren't given these, for lack of a better term, these positive affirmations. So what this shows is that seasickness is, in part, a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I'm a believer in the power of positive thinking, much better than thinking the other way. But it's good to see that there's some scientific evidence out there to demonstrate that positive thinking actually may have an effect. So I went looking on the web to see if anybody had maybe used one of these types of remedies for virtual environments, for training in simulators. And I came across an interesting article. And this article was presented at the International Driving Symposium on Human Factors in Driving Assessment, Training, and Vehicle Design. And what they looked at was, do these C-bands actually reduce driver simulator sickness? What they found was that in older participants, yes, this actually was the case. But there were also indications that there was a placebo effect, because the measure that they used was subjective ratings of sickness, so these weren't objective ratings necessarily. And it appeared that the ratings were lower because people rated the oculomotor discomfort lower, not necessarily the nausea. So that could have maybe skewed the results, and that's why people are thinking, or the researchers thought, this is potentially just a placebo effect and didn't actually have a physical effect. What they also demonstrated or found was that previous experience of motion sickness is not necessarily a good predictor of simulator sickness susceptibility. So they asked people if they were prone. They gave people a questionnaire. Are you prone to motion sickness? Have you experienced motion sickness in the past? So the people who said yes, they didn't necessarily have higher ratings of motion sickness when they were in this driving simulator. And there's a link to the article there on the slide as well. So I notice that we're running out of time here, but maybe another discussion point. So the self-fulfilling prophecy stuff and its effectiveness. Do you guys think that this would potentially translate to other applications? And for example, I'm thinking, could this be used in pilot training programs or nuclear maintenance worker pre-job briefs? I know in the nuclear industry, when maintainers go out to do a job in the field, they typically have a pre-job brief. It's called, they use this as part of their event-free tools program to reduce the chance that a maintainer is going to do something wrong. If they included or incorporated this self-fulfilling prophecy type, these affirmations or whatnot, in this pre-job brief, might that influence or positively affect the results or the performance of the job? I'm not sure. I wasn't able to come across any research that had studied this, but what do you guys think? And is there potentially a possible downside if we started to use this on a regular basis? So I just want to say thanks everyone very much for listening to me for this week. It's been my pleasure, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person. If you're ever planning a trip to the Middle East, feel free to drop me an email. And also, if anybody's got questions on what I talked about this week, or working in the nuclear industry, or just working in human factors in general, also just send me an email. I'd be happy to hear from anybody. Take care, guys, and enjoy the rest of the semester. Good luck. Bye.